Hey everyone, today we're going to be working on one way to make a feather. We're going to be making these feathers just like this out of wool. This is a merino wool that I'm using. What I'll be using is a hair straightener to straighten it at the end. Wire, I like an aluminum wire. It's nice and thin. In this case, I'm using a 22 gauge. The fabric stiffening spray, there's all different versions of this, but this is how we're going to stiffen our feather. My wool, I'm using two different colors just to show you some definition. Scissors, wire cutters or scissors for your wire, and an eyelash comb, which is my secret weapon for most of my needle felting. So the first thing we're going to do to make our feather is we're going to take our wire, and again I'm using a 22 gauge. I use this for larger feathers because it's a little bit of a thicker wire. I wouldn't use any thicker than a 22, but if you're doing really fine wires, you could go thinner. You just want to make sure that the wire is strong enough to hold all of your twists and hold the wool in place. So what we're going to do here to create our feathers, we're going to take our wool. I usually cut these bits a little bit longer than I want my finished feather to be wide, and then I trim it at the end. So what I do is I take little bits of wool. I like to keep these thin, and the first one is always the hardest, but I pull my wool and then I just do a little twist in my wire. You want to try to make sure this one is pretty tight. All of them are pretty tight, but it will get easier as you go on. So once I get that first one in, I'm just going to keep on using little bits of wool and wrapping it around. And I'm actually going to be using some different thicknesses of wool so that you can see the difference in when I add thicker wool and thinner wool. But for my feathers, I generally try to use small little sections of them so you can see it's pretty light. So I'm starting off the top of this as really thin little pieces. So once I get a couple twists in, it becomes much easier. So I just grab my wool, I pull it tight against the last one, and I just do a single twist. The single twist is enough to keep it tightly together and not leave a lot of spacing in between the twists that you're making. So you can see with, let's look at this one, you can see with this one how tight those little twists are and how well it holds those sections together. So that's what I'm going for with this. It's just little pieces of wool. I don't worry too much if some of my layers are bigger than others. It's okay if they're not completely uniform. But the thicker the pieces of wool I add in this section, the bushier my feather is going to be at the end. So if I'm making really thin, fine feathers, I'll try to use really thin pieces. And then if I want to do thicker feathers, I'll add some thicker pieces. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm just adding some slightly thicker areas in the middle so that you can kind of see the difference between the real thin at the top to the thicker, what the end result looks like. And this aluminum wire, it's just jewelry wire. You can get it at any place where you would get jewelry. And it's very thin, it's very malleable, it's very easy to use, to twist, and it's not expensive. So it works well for something like that. All right, so I did a couple really big sections so you can already see how thin it is at the top versus how much thicker it's going to be here. And then I'm going to go back into my thinner sections. Personally, I like to do my bits really thin. It does take longer. It's a longer process because you don't have as much wool going between each one. You end up twisting it more. But I like the thin look of the feathers afterwards. And again, don't worry if one side is longer than the other. That's why I cut my wool a little bit longer than I think I'm going to need so that I can trim it up after I get it in place. And I usually work my way almost down to the bottom because I've already planned how long I need my feather to be. This bottom part is where I will attach it to the bird. And so I'll kind of have this on and then I'll needle felt over my wire so that it's attached. And I can show that process at some point, how I do that. I have to make a lot of feathers before I'm ready to attach them now. I'd say it can be 100+ feathers on some of my larger birds. So it takes its time. All right, so here we have our feather. And the good thing about this wire is that it spreads out very easily. It straightens very easily. It doesn't matter if I had it a little bit bent. And you can see how I have my nice line in the middle. So this is where I'll take my eyelash comb and I'll brush it out. Just generally brush it how I want my feather to go. This will pull a little bit of spare wool out, some stray pieces, and that's absolutely fine. If you are getting large clumps of wool coming out, if you're lightly brushing it, you're either brushing it too hard or you didn't twist it tightly enough to really get them caught in there. So after I brush it, I'll just kind of gently trim out my shape for my feather. I will trim it one more time after it's dried, after it's been sprayed. So it doesn't have to be exact, but I like to get my general feather shape. And then I'm going to take my fabric spray. So in this case, it's Eileen's. It's a Stiffen Quick fabric stiffening spray. And I use a good bit of it to make sure it's saturated. And I also brush it through with my eyelash comb. This is my secret weapon. And they also make like a paste that you can mix with water and you can dip your feather in. I have not done that yet, but I'm thinking about trying it for larger projects because I might be able to get more bang for my spray. So you can see now how it's been brushed. It has a feather-like shape. It's still a little bushy, but it's got your shape of the feather. So now this one is dry. So this one I did a little bit ago. You want to make sure that it's really dry before you use a flat iron or an iron on it, because this will gunk up and stick to the hot plates. So if you do feel like you need to address it while it's still damp, put it between a couple pieces of parchment paper so that it doesn't stick. But this one's dry, so it's the same thing. You have your feather, and you can see how it's still a little bushy because it hasn't been straightened, but it's much harder, the pieces. See how they kind of stick together because they've been sprayed. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the straightener. I like this because it's portable, it's easy, it gets both sides. And I'm just going to slowly straighten it up. You have to be careful because the metal can conduct a little bit of heat. And if you're more comfortable, you can always do this with an iron. And if it's still a little damp, you can just put the parchment paper around it or on each side. But you can see how it's stiffening and it is becoming thinner because you're adding the heat to it. So at this point, I'll usually look at them. If I want it to be stiffer than this, I can always add a little bit more spray and let it dry, but you can see how it's kind of sticking together and it's got some stiffness to it. So at this point, I'll usually just trim it up a little bit more. Now, if you want, you can do a straight line for your feather. You can have a nice straight edge, or you can kind of, do it however you want your feather to look. If you want there to be a little bit of roughness to the edge. This is where you can have fun with it and do whatever you want. But the finished project is going to be a nice stiff feather. It holds its shape, but it still moves like a feather. You can pose it in different directions. You can use it in different ways. And then if I want it any stiffer than this, I would just add a little bit more of the spray. This one you can see is just a little thinner. I did my pieces of wool a little bit thinner for this one, but again, you can see how it's a nice stiff feather and it holds that shape. And so when I do my birds, I'll make hundreds of these and then I will line them all up, and then that would become the tail or the wings of my bird. This one is the one that I haven't yet straightened and that the stiffener hasn't hardened yet, but that will eventually turn into the wing and the tail of my bird. Hope this helps. It's just another way to make feathers, and let me know if you have any questions. Bye.